All right. We got some stuff to talk about today. We're going to talk about Ohio's Constitution and how it was fixed in 1851. And so just understand that Ohio didn't start out perfect in 1803. There were some things that required change, and this is one of those Ohio social studies standards that it's hard to find a lot of information on. So let's dive into it and see what was wrong with it and how they fixed it. So, there were four main problems with Ohio's Constitution. The first one was that the General Assembly had too much power. The second one, the governor had very little power. Third, the Ohio Supreme Court could not meet its requirements. And lastly, fourth, Ohio had a large amount of debt. So, if you're following along with the slideshow, you got to tell me how confident you are that you can name all four of those things, or you can remember all four of those things. And if you're following along with the slideshow, I want you to answer the question in the video right here. Now, we're going to dive deeper into each of these problems. And so maybe our first objective here is try to understand how the Ohio General Assembly had too much power. Well, the General Assembly had appointing ability. They could appoint key judicial and executive officers. So I want you to think about this. The Ohio General Assembly, made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, it's a legislative branch. They make the laws. Then they get to decide who enforces those laws. And finally, they get to decide who interprets those laws. So it's creating this unbalanced system of power here. So this essentially violates the checks and balances principle of government, okay? And again, the Ohio General Assembly made the laws. The Ohio General Assembly got to appoint people to enforce the laws. And the Ohio General Assembly got to appoint people to interpret the laws. Those three things are a problem. So, up next, video question number 2. Answer it here. Now the second problem, why the governor having very little power was an issue. So I want you to think about this. The governor, according to the Constitution, is elected by the people of the state of Ohio. But the people choose a guy who has very little power, the governor. And so there's another extent of this is that the governor couldn't even veto the laws. He didn't have the power to override any of the laws that the legislature was making. So we already talked about the General Assembly having too much power because they could appoint key judicial and executive people. But now they even remove some power from the governor once he is appointed or chosen by the people. And so he's just very weak. And so this violates popular sovereignty when we're talking about the 5 basic principles of government. Meaning that the governor should have enough power to essentially enforce the laws and balance the other two because the people choose him. And so he needs to have power to represent the people to make it maybe a true representative form of government. Now in my class, you're going to follow along the slideshow and you're going to answer a few questions, but let's make sure we do the video question as well for discussion points. Okay, now right now is a good time for you out there watching this to stop for a second. We've gone over 2 of the problems with the Ohio Constitution. Now think to yourself, is this something that I can grasp? Do I understand this? And if so, move on. If not, go back and watch it over again and just make sure you nail this down. I mean, I'm sure your teacher out there is hoping that you get something out of this for the Ohio State test. And it's really not that difficult of a concept. Most of the time it's just a drag and drop question. So just take the time to know it. So be able to name all 4 of the problems with Ohio's Constitution, and make sure you can tell me how the Ohio General Assembly having too much power and the governor having too little power mattered in this Constitution. Now if you're ready, let's move on. Problem number 3, the judicial branch, the Ohio Supreme Court, the top of the judicial branch. they were unable to meet their requirements. And so if you look at a map of Ohio in 1851 or even 1803 to 1851, Ohio's a sizable geographic location. According to the Constitution, the Ohio Supreme Court had to travel around and meet in each, I believe it was county. And so this is a time before airplanes, before trains really have taken over. So the way these guys were getting around were either walking, on horseback, or in their buggy, I guess. And so I want you to understand that this is a monumental task for them to travel all the way around the state of Ohio, do their job in 1 year. I mean, today it'd be 87 different places that they'd have to go to see in order to do their job. And so the lack of transportation made this job impossible to do. So again, real quick, the Supreme Court had to meet in every county at least one time per year. In a time where transportation was much slower than it is today, this made their job impossible. They couldn't actually do it. So they were being unconstitutional the amount they were actually meeting. Now at this point, take a second and stop and see if you can answer the video question listed here. And the last problem, the last major reason with Ohio's Constitution that we're going to talk about, the big problem, is that Ohio had a large amount of debt.
Where's my money? You gonna give me my money? Where's my money, man?
Okay. And part of the problem with this was that the tax money that was being raised within the state was not actually going to the things that it should have been going to. And so the Panic of 1837, which was a big recession or depression, it hit the state, and Ohioans had very little money due to banks closing down. Okay, so people couldn't access their money. And in order to prevent this from happening, the state had to kind of step in and take on some more responsibilities to ensure that the people were taken care of. All right, so now we've covered all 4 of the problems with Ohio's Constitution, sort of the reasons behind them. At this point, it'd be great for you to be able to answer this question right here, to kind of combine and analyze all of the 4 things and put them together and kind of see the big overarching problems with Ohio's Constitution. So go ahead and answer the video question, take a moment to reflect, heck, maybe even help out your neighbor. All right, now that we know the 4 major problems, let's dive into how the Constitution of 1851 fixed these things. So on May 6th in 1850, there was a meeting to kind of change or amend the Constitution or fix it. And eventually what they ended up doing was kind of addressing those 4 major issues in this Constitution, as well as a few other. And so the first one, it simply expanded the governor's power, okay? It did not give the governor veto power, and it also created a position of lieutenant governor. The second thing it did to fix this, it put in some procedural restrictions on the Ohio General Assembly. For example, it limited the General Assembly's ability to kind of incur debt and prohibited the creation of new counties without the residents' consent. Now next, it gave voters the power to elect some of those key executive and judicial people. For example, the voters could elect auditor, secretary of state, treasurer, attorney general, Ohio Supreme Court justices, and common pleas judges, all of whom had been previously appointed by the legislature. And so this is a big strike of away from Ohio General Assembly power, and now the people are the ones choosing the guys who enforce their laws, the guys who interpret their laws, and then by extension the people who make the laws as well. And finally, to help those Supreme Court officials out as they were supposed to meet in every county, they split up into other district courts, okay? And they were above the common pleas court, which your county has, or maybe even has a couple different branches of it. and it added these like appellate courts, or just above them, a level in between the common pleas courts and the Supreme Court, and they added that right in the middle so that they could kind of hear some cases, filter some of those things out before the Supreme Court had to respond to it. And finally, the Constitution did not expand suffrage, but it did kind of leave the option for them to revisit the Constitution. I believe it was like every 20 years, they could have a ballot and kind of decide if they needed to revisit the way the Constitution was structured. And finally, the General Assembly, or I think it's a referendum, or there's a way for the people to actually add a ballot to create a ballot to amend the Ohio Constitution, so the people have a direct power to, change it. And so, most recently, the one that sticks out in my mind was a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Ohio had a legalizing marijuana referendum on the ballot, and it was voted down. And actually, in its place, there was a amendment put in that sort of restricted monopolies from being created. Legislature being created to support monopolies, and there's a whole story behind that. Ask your teacher, ask your parents, I don't know, but it was kind of a unique application and more relevant contemporary case. So there you have it. The 4 problems of Ohio's Constitution. The General Assembly had too much power, the governor was very weak, the Supreme Court couldn't meet its responsibilities, and Ohio had a large amount of debt. And so they did those 4 things to fix the Constitution. So this is it. Study it, nail it, get it on the test. And I don't know if you can hear my little dude upstairs. It's time for him to go to bed. So until next time, see you later.